Right, hello party people and welcome to office hours. I just realized I didn't. Oh no, I did. I stopped my question or my music there. Good morning party people and welcome to office hours, the show where you post SQL Server or Microsoft Azure SQL DB questions and then upvote the ones that you'd like to see me cover. I don't expect a whole lot of chatters to join me today. I expect it to be kind of quiet because it is a Sunday morning here in the United States. It's 9:22 in the morning, and I'm waiting on the dry cleaner to open. I'm selling my Range Rover. I have a Range Rover, and somebody was supposed to meet me at 9 a.m., and then I was going to go to the dry cleaner. Well, it turns out they canceled, so the people who were looking at the Range Rover canceled. So now I'm just waiting for my dry cleaner to open at 10 and then go drop stuff off, pick stuff off, and then mostly goof around, probably play Dead by Daylight. I know I've mentioned a few times that I played Dead by Daylight, and I've streamed that in the past from Mexico. I need to set up a streaming. That's probably what I'm going to do today. I'm probably going to set up my streaming platform over in the home theater just so that I can stream that from time to time so you can see how bad I suck at Dead by Daylight. I mostly play Killer. I mostly play Wraith. I only play Wraith when I'm playing Killer. And I have like a 50-50 shot at being a good killer. When the match begins, what happens in the first 30 seconds dictates whether I'm going to actively kill everybody, or as a killer, that's your role. That's what you're supposed to do, is kill all the survivors, or whether I'm just going to game along with them and have fun and let them all live. It all depends on how those first 30 seconds go. Sometimes I'm a nice guy. Sometimes I'm not. So let's see what y'all upvoted in terms of questions. So the top voted question over at PollGab says, "Hi Brent, Rollback is single-threaded," who's asked a few questions here. Welcome back. Rollback is single-threaded says, "When I've got a microservices application infrastructure, should I have a database for every microservice, or should I have one giant database, a monolith that everybody tries to share?" Well, the whole idea behind microservices is you want to be able to deploy any of them individually and scale them individually. They should be able to change all the time independently without breaking any of the others. Well, by definition then, every one of them would need its own database. And depending on how you do it, they can even use different database storage platforms. Like some could use Reddit, some could use MongoDB, some could use SQL Server. But the question's so good because overall, one of the biggest problems that I've heard from clients who had big existing monoliths and they were trying to transition into microservices is, how the heck do we break the database apart? How do we, keep all these copies of the same data in sync? I have never seen an existing monolithic application successfully break out into microservices without leaving at least most of the data still in the main one database. So I wish there was an easy answer, but of course, as you're seeing when you go to microservices, there is not. Dudai Levi says, howdy, hello, good evening from Israel. I love Israel. I've been, I think, 4 times now, 3 times, either 3 or 4 times. Just absolutely love it. And I keep saying every time I go, I'm like, oh, I don't need to go to Israel again. And then the opportunity pops up and I'm like, I should probably go to Israel again. It's pretty cool. Next up, we have Fajita Pete. Fajita Pete says, once you've got more than 2 and 3 columns in an index, should you put the rest of the columns in the key or leave them in the includes? Well, like I talk about in my Fundamentals of Index Tuning class, it's all about narrowing down your search space as quickly as possible. If those first 2 or 3 columns are fairly unique, like let's say that you search by, or you do an index based on last name, first name, middle name, if that combination of those 3 is fairly unique and it gets you down to a very small result set, then it may not matter whether they're in the keys or in the includes. But sometimes if you take names like Jane Doe or John Smith, where there are still a lot of leftover rows, although really, are there a lot of leftover rows? There's not really that many. There's only like 10 or 20 or 100 maybe if you live in New York City. And sorting those may not be that big of a deal. So in theory, you're right. As long as the first two or three columns are very selective and really narrow down your search space, the rest of the column order doesn't matter. In practice, though, I see people put their first column on things like gender or alive, yes or no, where there just aren't that many choices, in which case you may need more columns than that. Next up, ILoveData asks, hey, it makes SQL Server 2022 makes it easier for people to call endpoints. What he means is from your T-SQL, you can now call a web service. He says, what are acceptable use cases for a feature like this? I appreciate the idea, but we all know how this will end up. Essentially, what it does is add latency to your code. If you want to wait to commit a database transaction until an external web service responds, hello latency, as Jeremiah Peshko would say. That adds latency to your code, and generally, latency is the opposite of what you want in a database application. So what it can be useful for is when this thing isn't in a transaction and it's not in the critical path. One good example of what I heard was somebody wanted to call a web service when the nightly ETL was done. At the end of the ETL process, call a web service, tell them that it's done and that some process can go on to its next step. And at that point, it wasn't slowing down inserts, updates, and deletes, and it was just one relatively small call, and we don't really care if that call fails or not. Renegade Larson says, welcome home from the cold north. Yes, I was up in Chicago. Even I went to West Michigan for about a week to see my dad's side of the family. And it was perfect timing because it got frigid right when we landed. Snow came down. And so Eve got to see the great frozen north, and then we flew back out. It was like 1 degree Fahrenheit. It was like negative 15 Celsius, I think, wind chill when we took off. And so it was like, that was a nice, they come back to Vegas, and I'm in a t-shirt. And I could really be wearing shorts today if I hadn't gotten up early. Next up, Dopinder asks, what's your opinion of SQL Server Management Studio 19? Is there anything to get excited about? For me, excited is the wrong word. It's just compatible with more stuff in SQL Server 2022 and Azure SQL DB. I don't get excited about that kind of thing because you could always do stuff with T-SQL anyway. It's just that basically they added more wizard capability, so I'm not really excited about it. I'm glad it keeps improving, though. First-time chatter, Marcus, hello. Says, live session with the SQL Guru. What could be better? Well, I could have a drink in my hand, but it is a little early. It's 9:30 a.m. on a Sunday. Next up, we have, Sajan asks, do you have any reasons why we shouldn't run SQL Server Management Studio on the server itself? He says, I know that using that CPU is one reason. What else is there? Memory is another good one, because SQL Server Management Studio requires memory, especially when people do things like pull large result sets down into the result pane. I've seen cases where SSMS used gigabytes of memory trying to paint the results pane, and of course that can put SQL Server itself under memory pressure, leading to other performance issues. Why would you run anything on the SQL Server when that SQL Server's licensing and CPU and memory are super expensive and rare? Run it on your desktop where it's cheap and you can get all kinds of, SSMS is free in terms of licensing. Next up, Mike says, my on-premises server has 16 physical cores, 32 virtual cores. If I move it to the cloud, how many will I need? Well, is your server busy? Doesn't have anything to do with how many cores you have. Are they doing anything? What if they're all bored? And what I usually find, I give good answers because I'm drinking the smart water. What I usually find when I work with clients when we go to do things like cloud migrations or even moving to a new server is, let's just go look at what queries are using the most CPU. And then if there's low-hanging fruit, you can tune them real quick, and then you end up using way less CPU power. And people go, well, we saved money by moving to the cloud. No, you saved money by doing performance tuning. It just so happened that you moved to the cloud at the same time. Otherwise, CPU in the cloud is generally much more expensive. Mike asks, when you deploy Azure VMs with SQL Server on them, how much does the licensing cost? I have no idea. I pirate all of... Did I say that out loud? I didn't say that out loud. I run Developer Edition in production. No, I just don't do anything with licensing costs whatsoever. The way that I approach it with clients is that I just simply say, okay, the standard edition is $2,000 US per core. Enterprise edition is $7,000 US per core. You can rent it from cloud providers, who you rent it from and how long you rent it from, or how long you rent it for, like years or hours, whether you do reservations in terms of licensing. Dramatically changes it, just gives you a rough idea. 2,000 a core standard, 7,000 a core enterprise, gives you a rough idea of the perspective from price differences. Then you can start to have discussions about how do we drive those CPUs down. But it's not like I can negotiate the cost. The cost just kind of is what it is. You can get with your Microsoft reseller if you want to learn more. And there are Microsoft resellers for Azure too as well. Next up, DevInHiding says, hi Brent, an older colleague of mine says that in older versions of SQL Server, one way of querying things was better than another. Is there anything to that? If someone, myself included, tells you that something is faster, it is my obligation to prove it to you with demos. It is not my obligation to prove what somebody else said. If somebody else says something is better or worse, ask them. And if they can't prove it to you with a demo, they're making things up. They don't actually know. They are parroting answers that they heard from someone else. They're doing something called cargo cult programming, which is an awesome topic. You should totally look that up. Not right now, though. You should pay attention. Curious DBA says, in which situations would you use cross-apply instead of inner join? Is cross-apply an optimal way to get SQL Server, blah, 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 blah. Okay, great question on that, and it's way beyond what I can do justice to in office hours. You can see it in my mastering query tuning classes. In my mastering query tuning classes, I have a module on cross-apply. If you're cheap, and I totally understand if you're cheap, after all, you're asking me questions on YouTube. If you're cheap, it's a more cost-effective solution to go get a book from Itzik Ben-Gan. Itzik Ben-Gan has a great series of books, T-SQL Querying and T-SQL Fundamentals, that go into massive depth on how to get the answers for that exact question. And they're cheap. Connie says, hi from Nottinghamshire. I'm probably butchering that, right? Nottinghamshire, United Kingdom. Howdy, Connie, and welcome to the chat. Let's see. Somebody, zlobnyfar, tried to cram as many letters as he possibly could into his question. What is the best way of generating logs about CRUD interactions and executed queries? This comes up all the time with me with clients, and here's the answer. Do you need to stand in front of a court of law and testify about your answer? Let's say that you work for a hospital and you get called in front of a witness stand to say, I know that this is the exact nurse who printed out George Clooney's health records and sold them to TMZ.com. This is the only nurse that did it. This is the only nurse that could have done it, and I have proof. And you're going to put that nurse behind bars or cause them to have a massive financial fine and never work again in an industry. If you have to stand in court and testify to it, go get a third-party auditing appliance, not software, an appliance that sits in between SQL Server and the network. Imperva and Guardium are a couple of common examples. They're expensive. but they log every network packet that comes and goes. They see who saw what, who inserted what, who changed what data. And you don't get access to them as a data professional. The security team gets access to them. And then that way, when there's a court case, the security team can say, here's exactly who saw the data, and they're even auditing you, what you do as a developer or a database administrator. If you don't need to stand in front of a court of law, you can use all kinds of tools like auditing triggers. There are third-party pieces of software. But you can't guarantee that they're right, because anybody with enough security to set them up has enough security to tear them down or delete data out of it. So you just have to be really careful about that. Standing in front of a court of law, get an appliance. If you're just doing it for your own curiosity purposes, I don't give a rip what you use. Next up, don't bother answering. There are all kinds of common names for DBAs. Don't bother asking is a common one, but I've never seen don't bother answering. It says, why does my query go parallel when its cost is 33.7 query bucks when my cost threshold for parallelism is 35 query bucks? It's a great question. The answer is that you're looking at the cost of the parallel plan. You're looking at the cost of the parallel plan, which is 33.7, but that's not what dictated whether or not it went parallel. What dictated whether or not it went parallel was the single-threaded cost of the query. SQL Server generated a single-threaded, a serial cost or serial query plan, looked at the cost and said, I bet I could do better. Parallel, it generated a parallel plan, which turned out to be cheaper, and that's the one that it rolled with. So if you want to see what the cost of the single-threaded one was, put in option maxstop1 as a hint, and then you'll see the cost of the single-threaded plan. Next up, this is a question that I've gotten a lot, over the last couple of weeks. Trushit asks, what do you think will be the impact of ChatGPT on SQL developers? I don't think it will be an impact at all. There have been tools that try to write queries when you give them plain English input. There have been tools like this for like 2 decades, and they crash and burn so hard on real-world data structures with things like complex relationships. It's relatively easy to get this stuff to work in a hello world type application, but as soon as you try to get anything harder, anything more realistic in terms of a data structure, they crash and burn terribly. It's not that I don't believe that they'll never get better. I think sooner or later they will, but you got to remember that they have to keep up with the pace of database development. A great way to think about this is reporting tools. Reporting tools that do drag and drop queries have been around for like 20 years. You could get, say, Tableau or Power BI, drag a few tables together. And even though those are visual and they have representations of the data in there and little lines to connect them and explain how the foreign keys work and all that, people still get bad answers and have to get human beings involved to build a rigid dimension, to build a rigid universe that relates those tables together. So I think it'll be interesting, but it's going to be a really long time before we're there. Next up, someone named Black Friday Bundle 2, woohoo, thank you for buying my Black Friday bundles, says, what is your view on page versus row compression? Well, if you bought Black Friday Bundle number 2, then you have access to my Mastering Index Tuning class, and you can go watch that module in order to find out what the answers are. You know what's funny is you can buy things like training courses and books, but if they just sit on your shelf, it doesn't really do you any good. You have to actually watch the classes in order to get across the finish line. Hop to work. Next up, we have Fillfactor 1% for the win asks, what are your thoughts about creating 3 Docker containers on the same box? One for physical, one for dev, and one for test. I am not a big fan of that because dev licensing is free, production licensing is not. So as long as you have to license the thing, go have a dedicated production server where you know that the thing is going to be reliable. It's going to have all the resources that it needs at the time in which it needs it. Build high availability and disaster recovery for that, and go do your dev test on less expensive hardware using SQL Server Developer Edition that is totally free. You can use last generation hardware, and then that way you don't have to worry about what happens off peak loads. I know you say in your question the production and dev test loads will never happen at the same time. You're wrong. Sooner or later, people are going to want to say, for example, do a database backup or run CheckDB, and they're going to want to do that in production when the rest of the production workload is low. When is that? When you're trying to do dev and test work. So don't try to save a few cents on SQL Server licensing there. Developer Edition, it's already free. Go run it on some other box. Next up, you got to do what you got to do, asks Brent. What's your opinion on the new T-SQL snapshot backup functionality? Do you see any hidden problems to be aware of? What this does is it kicks off a snapshot so that then you're going to need some kind of third-party tool, whether it's the ones that are built into Amazon or Azure or Google's cloud storage type stuff, whether it's pure storage. All this is doing is giving you an easier way to interface with those tools. You don't want to try to use the create backup a snapshot stuff just by itself. You're going to need other third-party tools. Those have always been there. This new 2022 change is more about making their lives easier, to make integration easier for you. It's less about like giving you tools to go build a wheel yourself. I don't have a problem with the feature. It's totally fine. You just need those third-party features in order to make the magic happen. Next up, Brandon says, any insights to offer how database design might differ? Oh, hey, we have a renewal there with drop table employees. Good to see you. Woo-hoo! Drop table says, I get tired of seeing the Twitch ads. I know, right? Doesn't that suck? I totally feel you on that one. Now, this is the same reason why I subscribe to a bunch of Twitch channels, because I like to hop in on their gaming sessions and go see what's going on. I hate waiting for the ads. So Brandon asked, any insights about how database design might differ when developing for microservices? Do you find it common to have many databases where there traditionally might be only one or two? For each microservice, you want to choose the best database for that microservice. If you have a Microsoft that's built with AWS, or you have a Microsoft, if you have a microservice that's built with AWS Lambda, for example, it's probably going to be a lot easier to find sample code and easy test code that you can copy paste. If you're using AWS databases like Aurora, for example, you probably don't want to have an AWS Lambda application tier and then try to integrate that with Microsoft SQL Server. So try to find the best of breed databases for whatever your microservice is built with. That's the place where I'd start. Next up, Rufus Stone asks, what's the appropriate punishment for someone who creates a database with a space in its name? I hate that. It's absolutely terrible. And so what I would ask him is, hey, do you know why this is bad? And if they say no, then you have them go write a few queries or edit a few queries trying to get them to work and say, now multiply this times the next 10, 20 years of technical debt where everyone who ever has to work on this database is going to struggle with the problems that you created. Can you see now why we don't want to do that? And if they say, no, I want it my way, I'd be like, okay, I might take your permissions away. Maybe you shouldn't be creating databases, and when you need a database created, come to me, because you're probably making other bad decisions as well. Ooh, next up, I use lowercase or uppercase for select says, how do you manage expectations at clients that not all index changes will be safe? You know, some are going to backfire in terms of performance. I like, when I'm doing index changes, I like making them every week for 3 or 4 weeks straight. I'll say on Friday afternoon, we're going to take a look at the index situation. We're going to look at which indexes we need to add, which indexes we're going to drop, which ones we're going to merge together. And I talk about that process in my mastering index tuning class. I say we're gonna do that on Friday afternoon. Then on Friday evening, Saturday, whatever, we're gonna put our index changes into place. Then through the next week, we're gonna let those changes bake in. We're gonna come back and look at it again the next Friday, and we're gonna iterate over that several weeks in a row. Some queries will get slower, some queries will get faster. And at the end of those 3 or 4 weeks, then we should have iterated over most of them and the backfires will have disappeared. If someone says we can't have any backfires, queries are not allowed to go slower, I'll say, okay, that's cool. We have 2 options. One is you can build a reproducible test for your workload. Spoiler alert, no one can ever do that. Or 2, you have to have me there watching so that if a query plan does get slower, we can go jump into action right then and there. Usually that latter one is the one that they prefer. And companies that have that high performance needs tend to have teams of data people like me looking over their application anyway, full time. Last one we'll do is from Sajawal. Sajawal says, "Hi Brent, you're doing great for people like me who love to play with SQL." Cool. Would you please guide us about what's DOP feedback architecture in SQL Server 2022? So the idea is, maxstop is the worst named parameter. Maxstop makes it sound like SQL Server is going to start at a small degree of parallelism and gradually inch up depending on how much data comes back from your query. That's not it at all. In fact, you could just wipe the term max out of maxstop. It's really just degrees of parallelism. So when queries go parallel, they go wild and crazy with the parallelism. Starting with SQL Server 2022, it starts to gradually back that down if the query consistently doesn't come up with a whole lot of data when it runs, and that parallelism is adding overhead. It's a really timid, gentle change, and I like that. Because I don't want Microsoft to go lob a feature in like they did with adaptive memory grants back when that first came out and just destroy performance, and they had to walk it back in the very next version because they were too ambitious. With degree of parallelism feedback, they're doing it the right way. They're dipping their toes in the water, figuring out what they learn, and then gradually they may add more power into that feature over time. It's basically, I was going to say it's basically useless. It's fairly limited in 2022. I don't think people are going to go high-five each other through the hallways going, oh my God, degree of parallelism feedback saved our lives. That's okay. I would rather have us learn slowly and gracefully instead of another mess like with adaptive memory grant feedback. Code with Sean says, good morning. Good morning. And with that, we're actually out of here. I'm going to go off and go. It is 10 minutes before 10, so my dry cleaner will be opened up by the time I get over there. Thanks for hanging out with me. I hope that y'all have a nice, relaxing Saturday and a fun rest of the week. See y'all on the next office hours. Adios.